The deed was written in the careful hand of a county clerk who had never once set foot on the land he was describing. 160 acres of elevated plateau, it read, situated within the boundaries of Mesa County, Arizona Territory. Assessed value negligible, practical use none recorded. The men of Stone Creek had a simpler name for it, the anvil. It rose from the valley floor like a fist of God, a broad, flat-topped mesa of bleached limestone and wind-scoured sandstone that caught the worst of the summer heat and funneled the dry desert winds down into the greenlands below. Nothing grew on it but scrub brush and a handful of juniper trees, so twisted by decades of wind that they looked less like trees and more like the frozen gestures of men in agony. The ranchers and farmers of the valley below had looked up at it for generations and seen only what it appeared to be. Useless rock, a geological afterthought. A place where the sun went to practice cruelty before it descended on the rest of them. On the morning of December 18th, 1878, that useless rock became the sole inheritance of Alara Vance. She was 19 years old. She had been a widow for 11 months. Her husband, a quiet and decent man named Thomas Vance, had been taken by a fever that moved through the valley the previous January, like a thief in the night, unhurried and indifferent, taking what it wanted. He had been 23 years old, strong as fieldwork could make a man, and he had been gone in 9 days. Alara had held his hand through all 9 of them. She had been an orphan for 10 years before that. Her parents had drowned in a river crossing gone wrong in the spring of 1868 when she was 9 years old. The wagon had tilted, the current had been faster than it looked, and the world had rearranged itself in the span of a few terrible seconds. She remembered the cold of the water and her father's hand releasing hers not by choice but by force. She remembered being pulled out on the far bank by a stranger and looking back across the rushing brown river for a long time before she understood that no one else was coming. It was her grandfather who had come for her 2 weeks later. Jedediah Vance had arrived at the neighbor's homestead, where she was being kept, climbed down from his buckboard and looked at her with eyes the color of old iron. He had not offered false comfort. He had not told her everything would be all right. He had simply said, "You are coming to live with me now," and that had been that. Jedediah was not a conventional man. He was 60 years old when he came for her, lean and deliberate in his movements, with hands that were permanently stained by the soil of the anvil, which he had been studying for the better part of 2 decades. He had purchased the mesa for $40 in 1859 from a territorial land office that considered him a fool for wanting it. He had paid them and said nothing and gone up to his useless rock and begun to learn its language. He did not fill Alara's head with the things most men fill their daughters' heads with. He taught her to read maps the way other men taught their children to read scripture. He spread his hand-drawn charts across the kitchen table on winter evenings and traced the invisible layers beneath the plateau's surface with a careful finger. He explained permeability and saturation, the difference between an impervious cap of shale and the porous sandstone that lay beneath it, the way water moved through stone over centuries, accumulating patient waiting. He talked about aquifers the way some men talked about faith, with certainty, with reverence, with the quiet confidence of a man who had listened long enough to understand what he was hearing. Stone remembers everything Alara he would say, tapping the map with one stained finger. "You just have to ask politely." She had thought she understood what he meant. She would not fully understand until she was standing alone in the dark beneath a mesa, in the worst drought in a generation, listening to the sound of water finding its way through ancient rock, and she would understand it then, not in her mind, but in her bones. Jedediah died in the first week of December 1878. He went quietly in his sleep in the narrow bed in the small stone house he had built on the edge of the Anvil's plateau. Alara buried him next to her grandmother in the dry ground beneath one of those wind-twisted junipers, said what words she could find, and then walked back inside and sat at the kitchen table with his journal spread before her and did not sleep for 2 days. The county notified her of the formal deed transfer on December 15th. The town council of Stone Creek scheduled a meeting regarding the drought crisis for December 18th the same evening. It was not a coincidence that these 2 events happened in the same week. The timing had been arranged by the man who ran Stone Creek the way other men ran their cattle herds, with absolute certainty that he knew best and that everyone else would eventually fall in line. Silas Harmon was 62 years old, and he had been the most powerful man in Mesa County for the better part of 3 decades. His ranch, the Double H, covered 11,000 acres of the valley's most fertile ground, and his cattle were fat and numerous, or had been before the drought began tightening its grip in the spring. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been burned to the color of old saddle leather by 40 years of Arizona sun. He spoke in a voice that was accustomed to filling large rooms, and he sat at the head of every table he occupied, not because anyone put him there, but because it never occurred to anyone to suggest otherwise. He had come to the land office quietly 3 months earlier in September. He had hired a geological surveyor from Tucson, a young man named Birch, who wore wire spectacles and carried instruments in a leather case, and he had sent that man up to the anvil on a Tuesday morning when Jedediah was already too ill to notice. Birch had spent 6 hours on the plateau, taking measurements, studying the rock exposures at the mesa's southern edge, consulting instruments that Jedediah would have recognized immediately. Birch had come back down with a report. Harmon had read the report once, folded it carefully, and locked it in the strongbox beneath his desk. Then he had gone to find a lawyer. On the evening of December 18th, 1878, the town hall of Stone Creek was lit by 6 oil lanterns and packed with every farmer and rancher who could make it through the gathering dusk. The air inside smelled of dust and livestock, and the particular kind of anxiety that comes when men who have spent their lives feeling secure begin to understand that the ground beneath their feet is not as solid as they believed. The river was the problem. The Redemption River, which had watered this valley for generations, had shrunk over the past year from a reliable muscular watercourse to a muddy, sluggish thread that wandered along its former bed like a man who had forgotten where he was going. The winter snows had been thin. The spring rains had not come at all. The summer had been merciless. Now in December, with the valley's wells already dropping and the river barely moving, the men of Stone Creek had gathered to decide what to do. Silas Harmon stood at the front of the room and told them. His voice filled the space, easily practiced and unhurried. "We deepen the town well," he said. "Another 20 feet should reach the table. Every household goes to rationing immediately. A bucket a day for the house half, that for stock. It will be hard, but it is the proven course. It is what men have always done when water runs short. You go deeper, and you conserve what you have." The room received this with the grim, nodding acceptance of people who are afraid and grateful to be given a direction, any direction that feels familiar. Harmon looked out at their faces and saw what he always saw: agreement, deference, the particular comfort that comes from following a man who has never been wrong before. He did not see Alara Vance until she cleared her throat. The sound was soft. It should not have cut through the murmur of a packed room. But there was something in the quality of it, something precise and unhurried, that made the nearest men turn first and then the ones behind them until the whole room had either rotated to look at the slight figure standing near the back wall. She was dressed in black, still the mourning dress she had worn since Thomas died. She was small in it, made smaller by the crowded room and the towering presence of the men around her. Her dark hair was pinned back simply. Her hands were clasped in front of her. Her face was composed in a way that 19-year-old faces rarely are, a stillness that came not from coldness, but from a long familiarity with difficulty. "Deepening the well will not be enough," she said. Her voice was steady, clear. It moved through the room without strain. Silas Harmon turned his large head slowly. The look on his face was not anger. It was something closer to patience, the particular patience of a man who is willing to humor an interruption before returning to the real business at hand. "The river isn't low," Alara continued. "The water table itself is falling. The shallow aquifers fed by the river are the first to go in a long drought. My grandfather's journals documented this. He tracked water levels in these wells for 20 years. What is happening now fits a pattern he described and predicted. Deepening the town well may give you another season, but it will not solve the problem." The room was quiet for a moment, in the way that rooms sometimes go quiet when something unexpected enters them. Then Harmon smiled. It was not an unkind smile. It was the smile of a man who has decided to be generous. "And what, Miss Vance," he said, "does your grandfather's journal tell us to do? Pray for rain? Read poetry to the stone?" There was laughter. Not cruel exactly, but the kind of laughter that comes easily when a powerful man makes a joke because it is safer to laugh than to be seen not laughing. Alara waited for it to pass. She did not look at the people who were laughing. She kept her eyes on Harmon. "The sandstone formation on the anvil is porous," she said. highly porous according to my grandfather's measurements. It has been absorbing and filtering water for centuries. The water is held within the rock itself, deep in the pore spaces of the saturation layer, protected from the sun and from evaporation. It does not drain the way a pond drains. It persists. My grandfather calculated the volume of the water-bearing stratum at roughly 80 feet of depth in estimated reserves that would be significant even in an extended drought. She paused. It needs to be collected, not from a surface spring, from within the rock itself. The silence this time was different. It had a texture to it, a kind of bewilderment that hadn't yet decided whether to become ridicule or consideration. Harmon gave it a gentle push in the direction he preferred. Collected, he repeated, from inside solid rock. He looked around the room to make sure everyone was sharing his amusement. And how do you propose we collect water from inside a mountain? Miss Vatic in a vertical shaft to the saturation layer, she said. And from the base of that shaft, a series of horizontal galleries carved into the water-bearing sandstone slope gently back toward a central reservoir. The galleries expose a large surface area of saturated rock, and the water seeps through and collects in the chamber below. It is an ancient method, documented in texts from the Persian highlands, refined in North Africa, used continuously for thousands of years in desert climates not unlike this one. My grandfather had a copy of a translated engineering text that described the system in detail. He believed the geology of the anvil was ideally suited to it. She had said more words in the last 2 minutes than most people in that room had heard her say in a year. She stopped speaking and stood very still in the silence that followed. Cal Peterson, a weathered farmer who held 20 acres of mediocre bottomland and a deep suspicion of anything that hadn't worked for his father, leaned forward in his seat. That would take an army of men, he said, and a year of work, maybe more. You've got no men, girl. You've got no money. You have got nothing but that useless rock up there. I will do the work myself, Elara said. The statement landed in the room like a stone dropped into a well. There was a beat of genuine, uncomprehending silence, and then the sound of men trying to decide how to respond to something they had never considered responding to before. Silas Harmon stepped forward. He moved slowly with the deliberate gravity of a large man who has learned that his movement through a space is itself a form of communication. He stopped 10 feet from Elara and looked at her with an expression that had reorganized itself from amusement into something that wore the clothes of concern. Elara, he said. He used her first name deliberately, the way powerful men use first names to remind young women of their place in the hierarchy. Elara, I understand this is a hard time. Grief does things to a person's thinking. Lord knows you've had more grief than anyone your age should have to carry. He paused, letting the sympathy settle over the room like a layer of fine dust. Sell me the anvil. I will give you a fair price. $50 is more than that rock is worth to anyone with clear eyes, and it would be enough for you to start a new life somewhere more suitable. Leave the water problem to those of us who understand it. Let us handle this. The room waited. The land is not for sale, Elara said. Her voice had not changed. It held no anger, no tremor, no accommodation. It was simply factual the way the deed of transfer was factual. And my thinking is perfectly clear. She looked around the room, once deliberately meeting the eyes of the men who had been laughing a few minutes ago. You are all looking for water in a pan that has already dried, she said. The reservoir is above you. I will begin work tomorrow. She turned and walked out of the hall. The room erupted behind her the moment the door closed, and she walked through the night air toward the trail that led up to the anvil, without looking back. She could hear the voices fading behind her, the particular tone of men reassuring one another that they were right and she was wrong, and she let the sound of the desert night, the dry whisper of the wind, the distant call of a nighthawk come up and replace it. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel afraid. She felt the weight of what she had just committed to the sheer physical impossibility of what she had announced, and underneath that weight, something steadier. The certainty that her grandfather had not been wrong. He had never been wrong about the stone. She had almost reached the base of the trail when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. It was Roscoe Finch, the proprietor of Stone Creek's general store, a lean and angular man in his mid-50s with a face like weathered cedar and eyes that missed very little. He was carrying his hat in both hands and moving with the particular careful haste of a man who wants to say something before he loses his nerve. "Miss Vance," he said, catching up to her. He looked over his shoulder before he spoke again. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not ask me how I know it." She waited. "Silas Harmon had a man up on your mace in September. A surveyor from Tucson, young fellow with spectacles. He was up there the better part of a day. Alara was still. Harmon knows what's in that rock," Roscoe said, his voice dropping. "Or at least he knows enough to want it. That offer he made tonight, the $50, that wasn't charity. That was a man trying to get hold of something before you figure out what it's worth." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I already know what it's worth, Mr. Finch. My grandfather spent 20 years measuring it." She turned and walked up the trail into the dark. In his office on the far end of Main Street, Silas Harmon sat behind his desk and looked at the surface of the wood grain for a long time after the meeting ended. Deputy Garrett Lude, his marshal, and the man who had served as Harmon's instrument in county matters for the better part of a decade stood in the corner and waited for instruction. Harmon opened the drawer of his desk. He removed a document that had been prepared 3 weeks earlier by a lawyer in Phoenix, a man who had done careful work with dates and language and the particular ambiguities of old territorial land records. He set it on the desk and smoothed it flat with his palm. "Give her a week," he said. "Let her start. Let her believe it. Then deliver this." Lude looked at the document and said nothing. "She'll be too committed to stop," Harmon said, "and she'll be too broke to fight back." He folded the document and handed it across the desk. She proved him wrong on the second count. But not yet. On the morning of December 19th, 1878, Alara Vance rose before dawn. She made a small fire in the iron stove and boiled water for coffee and ate a piece of bread that was 2 days old and did not taste it. She unrolled her grandfather's maps on the table and studied them one more time, not because she needed to, she had them memorized by now, but because it was the right way to begin. She traced the lines of the geology with her finger. The shale cap dense and impervious 12 feet on average. Beneath it, the Redemption, sandstone porous and saturated 80 feet of it, holding water in its pore spaces the way a sponge holds water, patient and quiet and invisible to everyone who had never learned to ask. She packed the maps carefully and went out into the cold gray pre-dawn and began. Her tools were her grandfather's, a heavy pickaxe with a hickory handle worn smooth by his hands, 2 long-handled shovels, a sledgehammer, a collection of iron wedges in a canvas bag. She carried them up to the spot she had already chosen, the location Jedediah's triangulation marks identified as optimal, the place where the geological survey said the water-bearing layer was thickest and closest to the surface. She had confirmed it with a spirit level of her own, devising a length of board with a channel carved along its top filled with water and calibrated with a plumb line. She marked the circumference of the shaft with a ring of white stones, 4 feet in diameter, precisely placed. Then she picked up the pickaxe and began. The first 5 feet were compacted soil and sun-baked clay, difficult but not impossible workable, with the shovel once the pickaxe had broken the surface crust. She moved steadily, rhythmically, filling the 2 oak buckets she had rigged to a simple rope and pulley system between 2 juniper posts. The morning sun came up and found her already 3 feet down. She kept moving. The work was physical in a way that felt not good but correct, like the application of force to something that deserved force. On December 22nd, she hit the capstone. The first blow of the pickaxe produced a jarring, ringing shock that traveled up the hickory handle and into her palms, her wrists, the bones of her forearms. The rock gave nothing. She hit it again in the same spot and again, measuring the depth of the mark she was making in the stone. 5 blows to make a dent the size of a coin. 20 blows to break off a piece the size of her fist. This was the work now. She would not hit the shale for nearly 2 weeks. The limestone cap was what it was, ancient and indifferent to her schedule, indifferent to the drought below, and the drying wells, and the cattle losing weight on the dusty pastures. The limestone did not care about any of it. It had been waiting in this formation for 100,000 years, and it would wait as long as it needed to. But Alara was patient in the way that people are patient when they have no alternative. She got up every morning before the sun and descended into the shaft by the rope ladder she had built from salvaged fence posts, and she struck the stone until the light failed, and she climbed out and ate whatever she had, and she slept without dreaming, and got up and did it again. By December 28th, she was 9 feet down. Her hands had blistered, and the blisters had broken, and the skin beneath had toughened into something that did not blister anymore. Her shoulders and upper back had developed a persistent deep ache that was present when she went to sleep and present when she woke up, and that she had stopped noticing, in the way you stop noticing the sound of wind once it becomes constant. She went into Stone Creek on December 30th, walking the trail down in the early morning to buy more supplies. She had $47 remaining, the last of Thomas's savings, kept in a wooden box beneath the floorboard of the small stone house. She spent $27 of it at Roscoe Finch's store on a dozen new steel drill bits, 100 feet of heavy hemp rope, and 2 additional oak buckets to improve her hoisting system. She said almost nothing during the transaction. Roscoe Finch said almost nothing either. But when she turned to go, he reached under the counter and set a small package on the surface. "Extra steel wedges," he said. "You'll need them when you hit the shale." She looked at the package and then at him. "Don't ask me about the price," he said. She took the wedges and walked back up the mountain. On the 5th day of January, 1879, she hit the shale. The sound changed before anything else did. The hard, ringing crack of the limestone gave way to something duller, flatter, a sound like splitting dense wood rather than breaking rock. Shale came off in layers, greasy gray plates that slid apart along their natural planes and coated everything, her hands, her hair, the walls of the shaft, in a fine silver-gray powder. It was slower work than the limestone in some ways and faster in others. The layers came apart more easily, but left sharp, unpredictable edges that caught the light of her lantern in unsettling ways. She was 16 feet down when she noticed the air changing. It was subtle at first, a slight increase in the humidity, a trace of something that her nose recognized before her mind could name it. Clean, cool, the smell of depth and darkness, and the slow, patient accumulation of moisture over time. She stopped striking and stood very still in the narrow shaft and breathed. She hit the shale harder the next morning. The point of her pickaxe punched through the last barriers on January 12th with a sound unlike any she had produced so far, a soft, muffled thud followed by a small, sucking release, as if the rock had been holding its breath. A gust of cool, damp air rose through the opening, carrying that smell with it, clear and dark and ancient, the smell of water that had never seen sunlight. She knelt at the bottom of the shaft and pressed her fingers through the hole. The rock on the other side was wet to the touch. Not soaking, not streaming, just wet. The fine grit of saturated sandstone coming away on her fingertips. She sat back on her heels and closed her eyes. Her grandfather had been right. The water was here. It was not a dream, not an old man's eccentric obsession. It was here, held in the stone patient as geologic time, waiting for someone to ask correctly. She did not shout. She did not cry. She sat in the bottom of a hole she had dug herself in the dark, 16 feet underground on a useless rock in the middle of the Arizona desert, and she felt something that had no simple name. It was not joy, and it was not triumph, and it was not relief, though it was something of all three. It was closer to confirmation. The kind that comes when you have staked everything on a belief and the universe at last responds. She stayed there for a long time. She had been back at work for 3 days when Deputy Garrett Lude rode up the trail on the morning of January 8th. He was a compact, flat-featured man in his mid-40s who wore his authority in the set of his jaw and the way he rode, upright and deliberate, a man who had confused the performance of power with its actual possession. He dismounted at the edge of the work area and looked at the shaft and the pile of excavated rock with an expression that was trying to be neutral, but was failing in the direction of contempt. "Miss Vance," he said. She set down the bucket she was carrying and looked at him. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He held it out and she took it and opened it. It was a legal complaint, filed in the name of Silas Harmon, representing a claim of ownership to 40 acres of the northern portion of the Anvil on the basis of a deed of transfer dated March 1871, alleged to predate Jedediah Vance's recorded purchase. The document requested an immediate halt to all development activity on the disputed acreage pending resolution by the county court. She read it through twice, slowly. Lude watched her and said nothing. She looked up. She looked at the document again, specifically at the date, at the ink in which the date was written. The body of the document was written in black ink of uniform color throughout. The date in the upper corner, the date of the alleged 1871 deed transfer, was written in an ink of very slightly different color. Not dramatically different, but different, as if it had been written at a different time with a different pen from a different inkwell. The difference was exactly what you would expect if a date had been erased from an existing document and rewritten to say something different. She folded the document and put it in her coat pocket. "Mr. Lude," she said, "tell Mr. Harmon I'll be at the county courthouse in Maricopa on Monday morning." She made the walk to Maricopa in 2 days, sleeping one night under a rock overhang with her coat pulled tight. She carried Jedediah's original survey maps in a canvas roll on her back. The maps he had registered with the Territorial Land Office in 1859, and she carried the counterfeit document, and she carried a letter she had written by lamplight on her last night on the mesa, laying out in clear and careful language the specific ink discrepancy she had observed and what it implied. The county clerk examined the documents for 40 minutes. He called in a colleague. They spoke in low voices. He came back and looked at Alara with an expression that was trying to be official but was leaning quietly towards something that might have been admiration. "The complaint will be dismissed," he said. "Do you want to file a counter-complaint for fraudulent documentation?" She thought about it for only a moment. "Not yet," she said. She spent $8 of her remaining $20 on court fees and walked back to the anvil. It was the night of January 16th when she returned. She had been gone 5 days. 5 days in which the shaft had sat silent at the bottom of the anvil, the shale breakthrough patient in the darkness, the saturated sandstone below accumulating its slow, continuous seepage into the nothing that was waiting for her reservoir. She built a fire outside the stone house and made coffee and opened Jedediah's journal to the passage she had read a dozen times since his death. It was an entry from 1871, 7 years before the drought, written in his small, precise handwriting on a night of winter rain. I am not certain of everything he had written. The measurements suggest what I believe, but measurement and proof are not the same thing, and I am one old man with hand-built instruments on a mesa that everyone else considers worthless. But I am certain of this: I have listened. I have listened to this rock for 20 years, and it has been telling me the same thing every season, in the language of seepage rates and mineral deposits and the direction of ancient water movement. The water is there. It is deeper than anyone has yet thought to look. Not because it is hiding, because no one has thought to ask it properly. Alara closed the journal and looked at the fire. Harmon would not stop at one document. She understood that now. The legal challenge had cost her 5 days and $8 and had been in Harmon's calculus a relatively low-cost first move. He had other moves. He was a man who had spent decades operating in a territory where money translated directly into leverage, and he had not yet spent very much of either. She thought about the document, the date, in the different ink, the careful handwriting of a fraudulent transfer. She thought about the surveyor from Tucson, the man with wire spectacles who had spent a day on her grandfather's mesa in September, and come back down with a report that Harmon had locked in a strongbox. He knew what was up here. He had known since September. And for 3 months while Jedediah was dying and then dead, Harmon had been preparing. Legal documents, offers designed to look like charity, a campaign to acquire the anvil before its new owner understood what she had inherited. The fire crackled. Above her, the Arizona sky was enormous and indifferent, scattered with stars that had no opinion about droughts or deeds or the ambitions of powerful men. She put the journal away and went inside. She rose before dawn as she always did. She made her coffee and ate what she had. She picked up the pickaxe and walked out into the cold morning air and descended the rope ladder into the shaft. The cool dampness rose to meet her, the smell of deep stone and patient water. She raised the pickaxe, and she began again to ask. The sandstone was nothing like the limestone. The limestone had been an adversary, dense, crystalline, indifferent in the way of something that has never had to accommodate anything. Every blow against it had been a negotiation conducted entirely on the rock's terms, and the rock had given ground only because Alara had refused absolutely and without exception to stop asking. The sandstone was different. It was softer, for one thing. Not soft in any way that made the work easy, but soft in the way that living things are soft compared to dead ones. It had grain and texture and a kind of internal logic that she could learn and work with. A wedge placed correctly along a natural fault line would produce a clean fracture and release a slab the size of a dinner plate sliding away from the wall with a sound like a slow exhale. A wedge placed incorrectly would bind and hold and accomplish nothing until she backed it out and repositioned it. The stone had preferences. It had directions it wanted to move and directions it refused. Jedediah had written about this in the journals. The sandstone will teach you more than any text he had noted in an entry, undated but written from context sometime in the early 1870s. You cannot bully it. You have to understand how it wants to break and then give it a reason to break that way. The water is already moving through it. You are simply creating a path of less resistance. She understood that now. The main chamber was to be 12 feet wide, 16 feet long, and 7 feet high, carved directly into the saturated sandstone at the base of the vertical shaft. This was the design Jedediah had drawn and redrawn across a dozen pages of his journals, refining it over years of study, consulting the translated Persian text he kept wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of his document chest. The dimensions were not arbitrary. They were calculated to create the maximum surface exposure of water-bearing rock while maintaining structural integrity, and they required her to remove by hand more than 1,300 cubic feet of stone. She started on the north wall of the chamber on the morning of January 13th, 1879, the day after she had first broken through the shale and confirmed the saturation layer. She worked with the hand drill first, a long steel bit turned by a T-handle boring holes 6 inches deep in a pattern she had marked on the rock face with a piece of chalk. Then she drove iron wedges into the holes with a sledgehammer, working across the row from left to right, incrementally increasing the pressure in each wedge until the accumulated stress along the fault plane reached the breaking point, and the slab released with that slow, decisive crack she was learning to recognize and anticipate. The pieces came down. She broke them into manageable chunks, loaded them into the buckets, hauled them to the surface with the block and tackle system, dumped them, and descended again. The pile of excavated rock on the mesa's surface grew slowly, a red-gray mountain of progress measured in cubic feet per day, visible from the valley below to anyone who cared to look up and study the skyline of the anvil. Most people in Stone Creek did not look up. They were too busy looking at their own problems, which were multiplying. The river reached its lowest point on record in the second week of February. The town well, which the council had deepened by 15 feet in December at considerable expense, was drawing muddy water that had to be strained through cloth before it was safe to drink. The communal pasture east of town was a dust bowl, the grass long gone, the cattle standing in the brown haze, with their heads low and their ribs showing beneath the loose skin of rapid weight loss. 3 families from the southern end of the valley had already packed their wagons and gone heading north toward Flagstaff or west toward California, their departure noted by their neighbors with a mixture of judgment and envy. Harmon's Double H had not yet reached crisis, but it was getting there. His wells were deeper than anyone else's, and he had invested in a secondary system of cisterns that caught whatever moisture the winter had briefly offered. But the cattle were thinner and the pasture was brown, and the men who worked his ranch moved with the particular economy of motion that comes from chronic thirst. He watched the numbers, the water levels, and the herd weights, and the cost of supplemental feed, and he saw the trajectory clearly. By summer, without relief, the Double H would be in serious trouble. He thought about the surveyor's report, which was still in the strongbox beneath his desk. He thought about Alara Vance on her useless rock, doing something that had no precedent in his experience. He filed the second document in the third week of February. Alara was 60 feet into the excavation of the main chamber, about 40% complete, when Deputy Garrett Lude appeared again at the rim of the shaft opening on the morning of February 19th and called down to her. She climbed the rope ladder and emerged into the pale winter light and took the document he held out without expression. This one was different. Lude had brought not a land dispute, but an official order from the office of the Mesa County Sheriff, acting on a formal complaint filed by a licensed mining and geological engineer named Reginald Ashworth of Tucson, Arizona Territory. The complaint stated that the excavation work being conducted on the plateau, known locally as the Anvil, presented a significant risk of subsurface destabilization, potentially compromising the geological integrity of the surrounding formation and endangering any residual groundwater resources in the region. It requested an immediate halt to all excavation activity pending a formal safety review by the Territorial Mining Authority. Alara read it twice. Then she read the name of the engineer who had filed it, Reginald Ashworth. She did not know that name, but she knew who would. She folded the document. She looked at Lude. He met her eyes briefly and then looked at a point somewhere above her left shoulder. "Tell the sheriff I'll respond in writing," she said. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table with Jedediah's journals and the translated Kannat text spread before her. She was there for 3 hours, not reading exactly, but searching, moving through the technical passages with the focused attention of someone looking for specific ammunition. She found what she needed in two places: a chapter in the translated text describing the structural principles of gallery excavation and the pillar spacing required to maintain load-bearing integrity, and a series of entries in Jedediah's journal from 1873 and 1874, in which he had calculated in careful arithmetic the compressive load distribution of the Anvil sandstone formation at various depths and determined that properly spaced gallery architecture would actually increase, not decrease, the structural stability of the water-bearing stratum by redistributing surface load more evenly. He had not simply predicted that the Kannat would work. He had calculated years in advance that it would be structurally sound. She wrote for 4 hours that evening by lamplight. The letter she produced was 7 pages long. It addressed every technical claim in Ashworth's complaint, point by point, citing specific passages from the translated text and specific calculations from Jedediah's journals with the relevant pages attached. She wrote in a plain, precise style that owed nothing to emotion and everything to the 20 years of patient documentation her grandfather had left her. She addressed the letter to the Mesa County Sheriff and to the Territorial Mining Authority in Prescott, and she made 2 additional copies by hand. She walked to Maricopa to deliver them in person 2 days each way, carrying the documents in oilcloth against the possibility of rain. She presented herself to the county clerk on February 24th and laid the letter and its supporting documentation on his desk and waited while he read. He called in 2 colleagues. They read it in sequence. The room was quiet for a long time. The safety complaint, the clerk said, finally will be referred for review. "Given the documentation you've provided, I would expect the halt order to be lifted within a week." She was back on the Mesa on February 27th, 9 days after Lude had handed her the document. She descended into the shaft, lit the lanterns, and picked up the hand drill. The order was formally lifted on March 3rd. She had lost 11 days. She did not waste time being angry about them. Anger was a luxury that consumed energy she could not spare. She had come to understand in the weeks since she had first put a pickaxe to the limestone that the work demanded a particular quality of attention that was incompatible with the kind of internal noise that anger made. The stone did not respond to frustration. It responded to precision. She gave it precision, but the 11 days had cost her something beyond time. The main chamber was complete by the first week of March. She stood at its center and held up a lantern and turned slowly, studying the walls, the ceiling, the floor. The space had a quality she had not anticipated. The glistening walls, the steady, almost imperceptible weeping of moisture from every surface of exposed sandstone, the absolute quiet broken only by the small, irregular sound of water finding its way through stone. It was not a room that felt carved. It felt revealed as if it had always been there, and she had simply removed what was covering it. She had chiseled the floor to a precise 2-degree slope toward the center, where she began excavating the sump pit 5 feet deep, 10 feet in diameter, the main reservoir. When she checked her work with the spirit level, the slope was accurate to within a 1/4 degree across the entire floor surface. She checked it 3 times. Then she started on the galleries. Jedediah's design called for 4 of them, radiating from the main chamber like the spokes of a wheel. Each was to be 2 feet wide, 5 feet high, and 50 feet long. The dimensions mattered. 2 feet wide was the minimum that allowed her to work inside to swing the hand drill and the wedge hammer without losing effectiveness. 5 feet high was the minimum that allowed her to stand upright without tools. 50 feet was the length Jedediah's calculations indicated was necessary to expose enough surface area to achieve the target seepage rate. She began the first gallery on the morning of March 8th, heading due north from the main chamber. The work inside the gallery was the most confined she had done yet. The walls were close on both sides, close enough to touch simultaneously with outstretched elbows, and the ceiling was a few inches above the top of her head. The lantern sat on the floor behind her, throwing her shadow long and wavering across the rock face she was working. She drilled, wedged, fractured, cleared. Drilled, wedged, fractured, cleared. The debris had to be passed back through the gallery in the buckets and then hauled up the shaft and added to the growing pile on the surface. Progress was measured in feet. On a good day, she advanced 3 feet. On a difficult day, when the rock grain ran contrary to her wedge angles, or when a natural void in the sandstone required careful shoring, she managed 1. She was 11 feet into the North Gallery on the afternoon of March 17th when the ceiling came down. There was almost no warning. A sound, brief and structural, like a large book falling from a shelf, and then 30 feet of gallery. Ceiling behind her, the section she had already completed dropped in a single event. The concussion of it knocked her forward against the rock face and filled the gallery with a dense, choking cloud of sandstone dust that extinguished the lantern instantly and left her in total darkness. She lay still for several seconds. The dust was in her lungs, and she coughed it out against the rock and then lay still again, taking stock. She could feel her limbs. She could move her fingers. The fall had not caught her because she had been far enough forward that the section that released was behind her, not above her. She was bruised and coated in fine red grit, and the gallery she had spent 9 days building was gone, but she was not pinned, and she was not injured in any serious way. She found the gallery wall with her hands and crawled forward on her hands and knees in the absolute dark until she felt the opening of the main chamber, and then the floor of it drop away beneath her palms, and she crossed the chamber to the base of the vertical shaft, where a thin column of gray daylight came down from above. She climbed the rope ladder. She sat on the surface in the pale afternoon light for a long time and did not move. The failure had a specific cause. She understood it almost immediately, sitting there with the red dust settling on her shoulders. The pillar spacing in the first gallery had been calculated on the assumption that the sandstone's internal cohesion was uniform throughout. It was not. There were natural variations in the rock's composition, layers of slightly different mineral density within the larger formation, and in the section that had fallen, those layers had created a stress plane that her design had not accounted for. Jedediah had written about this possibility. She had read the passage. She had understood it intellectually. She had not fully incorporated it into her pillar spacing calculations because the pillar spacing in the translated text had seemed sufficient, and she had trusted the text. The text was not wrong. But it had been written for a different sandstone in a different desert, and the anvil's rock had its own character, its own particular way of holding and releasing stress, and she had not yet learned it well enough. She sat with this for the rest of the afternoon. As the sun went down and the temperature dropped and the stars came out over Arizona with their customary indifference, she did not think about Harmon. She did not think about the drought or the town or the people in the valley below whose wells were failing. She thought about pillar spacing. She thought about stress distribution. She thought about the specific color and texture of the sandstone in the section that had failed versus the sections that had held. By the time the desert went fully dark around her, she had a revised design. She went inside and did not sleep for most of the night. She worked through the calculation by lantern light, checking it twice, then a third time, her pencil moving across the pages of a new notebook she had started for the construction phase. The revised pillar spacing was more conservative pillars every 4 feet instead of 6 thicker in cross-section, leaving more of the water-bearing rock in place. The gallery would advance more slowly and produce slightly less seepage surface per linear foot, but it would stand. She began again in the morning. It was on the morning of March 24th, her 4th day back in the North Gallery, that she heard boots on the rock surface above the shaft. She climbed out of the gallery and crossed the main chamber and went up the rope ladder and emerged into bright sunlight to find Clem Dortch standing at the edge of the shaft opening, looking down into the dark. He was a big man, mid-40s, with heavy hands and a face that had been burned and dried by 20 years of farming the valley's sandy eastern edge. She had seen him at the town meeting in December in the third row, one of the men who had laughed. Not loudly, but he had laughed. He was not laughing now. He was holding a pickaxe in one hand. It was his own, well-used, with a handle that had been broken and respliced with a leather wrap. He looked at Alara when she came up out of the shaft, and he did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the shaft and the pile of excavated rock and the small stone house and the rigging she had built, and he took it all in with the slow assessing attention of a man who has done physical work his entire life and knows what he is looking at. "I heard about the gallery coming down," he said. She waited. He turned the pickaxe over in his hands once. I've got two hands that still work, he said, and nothing else to do with them at the moment. Harmon bought my note. I lost the farm last week. She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved across the mesa and stirred the scrub brush at the edge of the plateau. I can't pay you, she said. I know that, he said. She looked at the pickaxe in his hands. Then she pointed at the shaft opening. The gallery is 2 feet wide. You'll need to leave the pickaxe up here and use the hand drill and the wedges. I'll show you the spacing. He nodded. He set the pickaxe down. They went back underground. Clem Dortch did not talk much. This suited her. He was a careful worker, slower than her, but methodical, attentive to the instructions she gave him about pillar spacing and fracture angle and the way to read the grain of the sandstone before placing a wedge. He made mistakes, and he did not make the same mistake twice. He carried the debris out of the gallery without being asked, and he asked clear questions when he did not understand something, and he stopped asking questions once he understood. By the end of the first day, she had advanced the gallery further than she had managed in 2 days working alone. She said nothing about this, but she noted it. They worked together for 3 weeks, moving in parallel when the gallery width allowed it and in sequence when it did not. The North Gallery reached its 50-foot target depth on April 11th. They began the East Gallery on April 13th, working faster now, because Alara had fully internalized the revised design and Dortch had learned the rock's particular language well enough to read it on his own. The South Gallery was begun on April 22nd and the West on May 4th. During all of this, the valley below was moving from crisis toward catastrophe. Alara went down to Stone Creek once on the evening of April 15th, walking the trail in the last of the daylight to buy supplies with the money she had left. She had $14 remaining. The town she walked through was not the town she had walked through in December. The difference was in the faces and in the sounds, or rather, the absence of them. The normal noise of a working community, the hammer on metal from the blacksmith shop, the voices of children in the schoolyard, the movement of loaded wagons on the main street was largely gone, replaced by a quiet that was not peaceful but depleted. The water line at the town well was 40 minutes long. She watched it from across the street. The people in the line stood without speaking, holding their buckets, their faces carrying the specific expression of people who are being very careful not to let themselves feel how afraid they are. She went into Roscoe Finch's store and bought what she needed and carried it back up the mountain. She was 2 blocks from the store when she heard her name. She turned. Harmon was coming out of the stone building that housed his Mesa County Land Office account, accompanied by Lude. He crossed the street toward her with his hat on and his hands at his sides, in the particular deliberate pace of a man who wants to appear unhurried. He stopped 6 feet from her and looked at her pack and her supplies and the dust that was permanently embedded in the creases of her hands and the lines around her eyes. Still digging, he said. It was not a question. Still digging, she agreed. He looked at her steadily. There was something different in his face from what had been there at the December meeting. The easy contempt was gone, or at least diminished. What had replaced it was harder to name. Not respect. Not yet. Something more unsettled than that, something he was working to keep from showing. It won't work, he said. She shifted the weight of the pack on her shoulders. You've been up there for 4 months, he said. You've lost 11 days to legal proceedings. You've had a gallery collapse. You're working with one man and barely enough money to keep yourself fed. And the summer is coming. Whatever you think is in that rock, you won't reach it in time. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the North Gallery, completed its walls glistening with a continuous seep of moisture, the 5 feet of clear water already accumulated in the sump reservoir. She thought about Jedediah's calculation, 20 years of careful measurement, the certainty of a man who had spent 2 decades listening. She shifted the pack again. Goodbye, Mr. Harmon, she said. She walked back up the mountain. He watched her go. Lude, standing at his shoulder, said nothing. Harmon turned and went back to his office and sat behind his desk and did not open the strongbox. He did not need to look at the surveyor's report again. He knew what it said. He had known what it said since September, and in the months since he had done everything a man with his resources could reasonably do to prevent a 19-year-old widow from reaching the water that the report described. It had not worked. He was running out of options that did not require him to admit something he was not yet prepared to admit. The crisis on the valley floor arrived in stages during the month of April, each one worse than the last. The town well went dry completely on April 18th. Not diminished, not brackish, drawn. The deepening effort of December had bought the town exactly 4 months. Harmon's own private drilling operation, the team of professional drillers he had brought in from Tucson at considerable cost, struck a shelf of solid granite at 90 feet on April 23rd and could not advance past it. The equipment was inadequate for granite, and ordering replacement bits would take 3 weeks minimum. The drillers packed their equipment and presented Harmon with their bill and rode back to Tucson. The Double H's secondary cistern system. Harmon's insurance ran dry by the end of April. He had water trucked in from a source 30 miles north at ruinous expense enough to keep the remaining cattle alive and his household functioning at minimal levels. It was not sustainable. He knew that. Everyone in the valley knew their own version of the same arithmetic, and the arithmetic did not balance. Families continued to leave. By the end of April, 8 households had packed and gone. The school closed for lack of attendance. The blacksmith, a man named Ord, who had been shoeing horses in Stone Creek for 15 years, nailed his shop shut one morning and drove away with his family in a wagon piled high with tools. The community of Stone Creek, Arizona Territory was dying by increments, each increment more difficult to reverse than the last. On the evening of April 28th, Alara returned to the stone house after a day spent lining the west gallery floor with flat stones and clay to optimize the seepage collection rate. She ate a small meal of dried beans and bread, and then she opened the wooden box beneath the floorboard and counted the money inside. $3.40. She set the coins back in the box and sat for a moment with the lantern light steady around her. She opened the small cloth pouch on the cord around her neck, the one she had worn since Thomas died, and took out the ring it contained. Plain gold band slightly worn on the inner edge. Thomas had saved for it for 8 months. She held it in her palm for a long time. She was still sitting there when she heard a horse on the trail. She put the ring back in the pouch and went to the door. The rider was a woman dismounting carefully in the near dark at the edge of the clearing. She was perhaps 50 years old, well-dressed, despite the dust of the trail, with a posture that had been educated by decades of a certain kind of social position. She tied her horse to a juniper branch and turned and saw Alara in the doorway. Augusta Harmon said nothing. She did not step forward. She looked at Alara for a moment with an expression that was completely unreadable. And then she turned and looked at the shaft opening and the pile of excavated rock and the rigging and the stone house, taking all of it in with slow, thorough attention. Then she sat down on the largest piece of excavated sandstone near the shaft entrance. She sat there for a long time. The night deepened around her. The stars came out. Alara stood in the doorway and watched her sit in the way that you watch someone who is doing something you do not fully understand, but that clearly means something. Augusta Harmon did not ask for water. She did not speak. After perhaps an hour, she stood untied her horse mounted and rode back down the trail without once looking back at Alara. The next morning, without explanation or announcement, Roscoe Finch appeared on the mesa with a mule loaded with supplies. Flour-dried beans, lamp oil, rope, 3 new steel chisels still wrapped in the paper from the manufacturer. He unloaded the mule in silence. She watched him. "Jedediah saved my boy back in '61, he said finally without looking at her. "Fever, same kind that took your Thomas. Most folks thought the boy was done. Your grandfather sat with him 2 nights and knew which herbs to use and how. He didn't ask for anything for it. He said some debts are paid forward." He set the last bundle down and straightened his back. "This is me paying forward." She looked at the supplies, then at Roscoe. "He's going to make it harder before he makes it easier," Roscoe said. "Harmon, he's desperate now. Desperate men make bad decisions." "I know," she said. "How close are you?" She looked at the shaft entrance. 3 galleries complete, the 4th halfway done. The reservoir's filling. A few more weeks. Roscoe nodded slowly. He picked up the mule's lead rope. "I'll tell people you've got nothing," he said. "That you're nearly done. That it doesn't look like it's going to work." She looked at him. "He'll stop trying to stop you if he thinks you've already failed," Roscoe said. "Give you a few weeks of quiet to finish." She thought about this. She thought about Harmon in his office, watching the water levels fall, running the numbers, reaching the end of his options one by one. "Tell him whatever you think he'll believe," she said. Roscoe led the mule to the trail and started down. The 4th gallery, the western one, was the most difficult. The sandstone in the western section of the chamber had a different texture, finer grained, and more prone to the stress fractures that had brought down the first gallery in March. Alara and Dorch advanced it carefully, checking the pillar spacing twice before each fracture sequence, reading the rock face before each drill placement, with the careful attention of people who have learned that this particular stone has opinions and will express them forcefully if disrespected. They finished the West Gallery on May 21st. Alara spent 3 days after that in final work sealing the collection channels with flat stones and clay, confirming the floor slopes throughout the system, improving the rope and pulley arrangement for drawing water from the sump. She carved a series of measurement marks into the wall of the sump pit, calibrated with a measured length of rope so that the water level could be read without descending to the chamber floor. On the morning of May 24th, she descended alone into the main chamber and held the lantern high and turned slowly in the silence. The four galleries stretched away into darkness on all four sides, their walls and ceilings glistening with the continuous seep of moisture from the water-bearing sandstone. The sound of it was steady and even, and everywhere the small, rhythmic percussion of individual drops finding the carved stone channels and following the carefully engineered slope back to the central chamber. In the sump pit, the water stood at a depth of nearly 4 feet clear, as poured glass, cold in a way that the desert surface never was. She dipped her hand into it. The water covered her fingers and her palm, and the cold of it moved up through her wrist. She thought about her grandfather sitting at the kitchen table, with his map spread out and his ink-stained hands tracing the invisible layers of a formation that everyone else saw as worthless stone. She thought about the 20 years he had spent on this plateau, listening, asking the right questions, recording what the stone told him with the patience of a man who knew that the answer would come eventually to anyone who was willing to wait long enough to hear it. Stone remembers everything. She stood in the dark and the cool in the silence with the water cold around her fingers. Above her, through 60 feet of rock, Arizona burned without mercy in the June sun. The valley was cracked earth and empty wells in the Wakidon bone-deep thirst of a community that had used up every answer it knew. The river was a dry memory. The cattle were gone or going. The families who remained were doing so on the kind of stubborn faith that is almost indistinguishable from despair. But here in the dark in the chamber she had built with her hands over 6 months of solitary and unwitnessed work, the water moved through ancient stone and fell in steady drops and accumulated with patient inevitability in the reservoir below. The stone had remembered. She had only had to ask. The summer of 1879 arrived in Arizona territory not gradually, but all at once, the way a furnace door opens. One morning in early June, the temperature climbed past 100 degrees before noon and did not come back down after sunset, and the nights that followed were hot and airless and full of the sound of animals in distress from the valley below, a sound that carried up the mesa in the dark hours and settled over the plateau like a second kind of thirst. Alara heard it every night. She slept on a bedroll outside the stone house when the air inside became too close, and she lay on her back and looked at the stars and listened to the valley dying by degrees. And she thought about the water 40 feet below her. Her 4,000 gallons of it, now cold and clear, and accumulating at a rate of roughly 100 gallons per day, regardless of what the sun did, regardless of what the wind did, regardless of the particular cruelty of this particular summer in this particular corner of a territory that had never been generous with its moisture. The water did not know about the drought. That was the thing about it, the thing Jedediah had tried to explain across a dozen journal entries, and that she now understood completely. The water in the saturation layer had been accumulating since before anyone alive could remember. It had filtered down through the plateau's porous surface over centuries, moving with glacial patience through the pore spaces of the sandstone held there by the impervious shale cap above and the granite shelf far below. The river's low levels in the dry winter and the merciless summer had not reached it, could not reach it. It existed in a separate time from the drought, a geological time measured not in seasons but in centuries. And it would still be there when the drought had ended and been forgotten, and the people of Stone Creek had been replaced by their grandchildren and their grandchildren's grandchildren. She had not built a well. She had found a river that ran underground through rock in the dark, and she had given it a door. On the morning of June 2nd, she built the capstone structure over the shaft entrance. She used the excavated rock, fitting the pieces together without mortar, In the dry stack method Jedediah had described in his journals, working from the outside in each course of stone, slightly inward leaning, to create a domed effect that would shed rain if it ever came and resist the weight of a man walking across it. The structure was circular, 10 feet in diameter, with walls 2 feet thick and a low arched doorway facing south. She fitted the door herself from a plank of Douglas fir she had carried up from town in 3 sections, and assembled on the mesa, hung it on iron hinges set into the stone with a mixture of lead and tallow, and fitted it with a heavy iron latch. From outside, it looked like a small stone hut, squat and unadorned, sitting at the edge of the plateau's southern face with the indifference of something that had always been there. A person who did not know what it was would have walked past it without particular interest. She stood back and looked at it for a long time. She had spent a total of $42 on materials over 6 months. She had $5 remaining. She had excavated a vertical shaft 16 feet deep, a main chamber 12 by 16 feet, and 7 feet high, 4 radiating galleries each 50 feet long and 5 feet high, and a central sump pit 5 feet deep and 10 feet wide. She had moved by her own calculation approximately 2,000 cubic feet of rock, most of it by herself, all of it by hand. She had done it in 6 months and 3 days. She went inside the stone house and sat at the table where Jedediah's maps were still spread, as they had been every morning since December, and she looked at them for a while. Then she rolled them carefully and tied them with the leather cord he had always used, and put them back in the oilcloth sleeve and laid them on the shelf above the stove where he had kept them for 20 years. Then she went outside and sat in the shade of the capstone structure, with her back against the cool stone, and listened. The valley was quieter now than it had been in winter. Not the quiet of rest, but the quiet of exhaustion. The kind of quiet that settles over a place when most of what was making noise has stopped. Down in Stone Creek, Silas Harmon sat on the veranda of the Double H Ranch house and watched the dust. There was always dust now. It moved across the valley floor in slow, low rolls when the wind came up, red and fine-coating everything it touched with the uniform gray-red of the dried riverbed. The cottonwood trees along what had been the Redemption River's bank were dead or dying, their leaves gone brown and crisp in a season when they should have been green. The pasture fences stood over nothing. The water troughs were empty. The barn held a fraction of the cattle it had been built to accommodate, and the ones that remained were thin in a way that made Harmon feel something he was not accustomed to feeling. Responsible. Not for the drought. He was not a man given to the kind of self-examination that led to that conclusion easily, but responsible in some way he could not yet fully articulate for the distance between what this valley was now and what it could have been if different decisions had been made 6 months ago. If he had listened in December to a 19-year-old girl standing at the back of a room full of men who knew better. Augusta brought water to the veranda in the late afternoon, a tin cup half full. She set it on the railing beside him without comment and went back inside. He looked at it, half a cup of water, on his own ranch, on land he had built from raw territory over 30 years. He reached out and picked it up and held it, but did not drink. He had been running numbers for 3 days straight. The trucked-in water from the northern source was costing him more per week than he used to spend in a month on everything combined, and the source was becoming unreliable as other communities in the region competed for the same supply. His remaining cattle were consuming feed at a rate that was not sustainable beyond July. His ranch hands had been paid through June, but 3 of them had already told him quietly that they were thinking about their families and what came next. Garrett Lude had resigned on May 30th. He had come to Harmon's office in the morning with his badge in his hand and set it on the desk without drama. He was a man of limited words at the best of times, and this was not the best of times. "I've got a wife and 2 boys," he said. "I've been loyal to you for 11 years, Mr. Harmon. I need to be loyal to them now." Harmon had looked at the badge on his desk for a moment. He had not argued. He had paid Lude what he was owed and an additional month's wages and shaken his hand, and Lude had walked out of the office and out of Stone Creek with his family in a wagon by noon of the same day. After Lude left, Harmon had sat at his desk for a very long time. He opened the strongbox. He took out Birch's report, the Geological Survey from September 1878, and read it again from the beginning. He had read it many times over the past 8 months, but he read it differently now. Not as a document describing an asset he intended to acquire, as a document describing something he had spent 8 months trying to prevent. The saturation layer in the southern sandstone formation is highly significant, Birch had written in his careful professional hand. The pore volume and permeability measurements indicate a water reserve of considerable scale held under the impervious shale cap at a depth of approximately 16 feet from the plateau surface. A properly engineered extraction system, specifically a shaft and gallery arrangement of the type documented in historical desert hydraulics literature, would yield a reliable and substantial water supply independent of surface precipitation levels. This formation represents, in my professional assessment, one of the most significant undeveloped water resources in the Arizona Territory. He folded the report and put it back. He sat for a while longer. Then he got up, walked to the stable, and saddled his horse alone without calling for help. He rode out of the ranch yard in the early morning of June 10th without telling anyone where he was going. He followed the dry riverbed east until he reached the base of the Anvil's western trail, and he dismounted and tied his horse to a dead cottonwood and began the climb on foot. The trail was steep and the morning was already hot, and he was 62 years old and had not climbed a mountain in 20 years. He went slowly. His boots slipped twice on loose shale. He stopped halfway up and looked down at the valley, at the brown expanse of it, at the dry riverbed and the empty pastures and the dust moving slowly across what had been not long ago the most productive agricultural land in Mesa County. He went on. He reached the plateau rim and stood for a moment, catching his breath. The wind was different up here, cleaner, carrying the faint mineral smell of the stone. He looked across the flat surface of the mesa toward the small stone structure near the southern edge. Alara was sitting against the wall of it, watching him. She had seen him coming up the trail. She had not moved or prepared anything. She simply sat and watched him cross the plateau toward her, a large man moving slowly without his hat, for once his gray hair visible in the full morning light. He stopped 10 feet from her. He looked at the stone structure, at the heavy door with its iron hinges, at the rope and pulley system still rigged near the shaft, at the pile of excavated rock that had grown over 6 months into a small mountain of red-gray stone. He looked at all of it for a long time. Then he looked at her. "Show me," he said. It was not the voice he had used in the town hall in December. That voice had been the voice of a man performing certainty for an audience. This was something else. Quiet, almost careful. The voice of a man who has run out of performances. She stood up without hurrying and went to the door of the capstone structure and lifted the iron latch and swung it open. The cool air came out immediately, that smell she had come to know better than almost any other smell in the world. Deep stone and dark water, and the particular clean quality of moisture that has been underground for a very long time. She took the lantern from its hook inside the door and lit it and held it out to him. He looked at the lantern. He looked at the shaft opening and the rope ladder descending into the dark. He took the lantern. He went down alone. She did not follow him. She stood at the surface in the full morning light and listened to the sounds of his descent, the careful placement of each foot on the rope ladder rungs, the slight creak of the hemp under his weight, and then the soft sound of his boots on the chamber floor 60 feet below. Then silence. She waited. The silence went on for longer than she expected. She stood at the shaft opening and looked down into the dark and could see the distant glow of the lantern steady and unmoving far below. She thought about what he was seeing, the glistening walls, the 4 galleries stretching away into darkness, each one exhaling its continuous whisper of seeping water. The carved stone floor sloping with its precise 2-degree angle toward the central sump. And in the sump, the water, 4,000 gallons of it, cold and clear and patient. The lantern glow shifted. She heard him move. Then she heard a sound she had not expected, a single sound, brief and low, that might have been many things, and that she understood from its quality to be the sound a man makes when he has been holding something in for a very long time, and the thing he has been waiting to feel finally arrives. She looked away from the shaft opening. She looked out across the plateau and down into the valley below, at the brown and broken land, at the dust moving in slow rolls across the dry riverbed. She waited. It was nearly 20 minutes before she heard him on the ladder again. His ascent was slower than his descent had been. When he came up out of the shaft and straightened and stood in the morning light, his face was different. The set of the jaw was the same, the physical structure of the man was the same, but something behind the eyes had shifted. Some arrangement of certainty and pride that had been in place for decades had been quietly reorganized. His right hand was wet. He had put it in the water. He looked at her. He opened his mouth. He closed it again. She let him have the silence. She did not fill it. He tried again. I came up here, he said, and then stopped. He looked down at his wet hand and seemed to be considering something. When he looked back up, he met her eyes directly for the first time in all the months she had known him. I came up here alone because I did not want anyone to see me. If I was wrong, he said. If it was nothing. If you had spent 6 months digging a hole in a mountain and there was nothing in it, I did not want anyone to see me looking at it. He paused. That is not a generous thing to admit. She said nothing. It is not nothing, he said. No, she agreed. It is not nothing. He looked back at the shaft entrance for a moment. 4,000 gallons, he said. Birch estimated 6,000 at full capacity. Can it reach that at the current seepage rate? She said it will reach 6,000 by the end of July and maintain that level indefinitely. Indefinitely. The words sat between them in the hot morning air. He nodded slowly. Then he said, I'll pay whatever you ask, whatever price you name. I have money less than I did, but enough. Name the price for the water rights, and I will pay it. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about December, about the town hall and the laughter and the $50 offer wrapped in condescension. She thought about Garrett Lude riding up the trail with his legal documents. She thought about 11 days lost to fraudulent land claims and 9 days lost to false safety complaints, and the gallery that had come down in March and the night she had sat at the table with Thomas's ring in her palm and $3.40 in the box. She thought about Clem Dortch, who had lost his farm to Harmon's debt buying and had come up the mountain anyway with his broken-handled pickaxe and worked 3 weeks without pay. She thought about Roscoe Finch, who had settled a 20-year debt to a dead man by loading a mule with supplies and walking up a trail. She thought about Augusta Harmon sitting on a piece of excavated sandstone in the dark without saying a word, and then riding back down and doing whatever it was she had done afterward, whatever quiet conversation or refusal of conversation had changed the atmosphere in the Harmon household in ways Alara could not see from the mesa. She thought about Jedediah, 20 years of patient work, 20 years of careful measurement and documentation, and the absolute conviction that the stone would provide if asked correctly. The water is not for sale, she said. Harmon was still. It has never been for sale, she continued. Not when you offered me $50 in December and not now. The water belongs to the valley, to the people in it, all of them not in proportion to the size of their land holdings or the depth of their pockets. She looked at him steadily. But there will be terms. He waited. 3 of them, she said. He did not move. The first, you will sign a document prepared by the county clerk stating formally and in your own name that Jedediah Vance's geological assessment of this formation was correct. That document will be read aloud at a town meeting in Stone Creek, witnessed by whoever remains in the valley. His name will be on the record of this county as a man who was right when everyone else was wrong. That is not negotiable. Something moved across Harmon's face. Not resistance. Something more like the expression of a man receiving a punishment he has already decided he deserves. The second, she said, Clem Dortch's farm note will be canceled. His land returned to him free of any debt to you with a written transfer registered at the county office. He worked this system with his hands, and he lost his farm because you bought his debt to pressure him. That will be undone. Harmon was looking at the ground now. The third, she said, I will lead the Water Council. All decisions regarding the distribution, rationing, and maintenance of this system will require my approval. Not majority vote, not council consensus. Mine. Until the drought ends and the valley is stable, the water is my responsibility, and the decisions about it are mine. The silence that followed had a particular quality. It was the silence of a man conducting a final accounting of everything he had believed about himself and the world he operated in, and arriving at a number that was different from what he had always assumed. He looked up. He reached into his coat and removed a small leather folder and opened it. Inside was a folded paper and a short pencil, the kind he carried for noting cattle counts and land figures. He unfolded the paper on the flat top of the nearest piece of excavated stone. He looked at the 3 terms once as if reviewing them in his mind, and then he wrote his name at the bottom of the paper in the large deliberate signature of a man who has signed many documents. He looked around for something to write on. Then he turned to the side and straightened his back and held the paper against it. He looked at Alara. She held the paper flat against his back while he signed. Clem Dortch, who had been sitting on a flat rock 40 feet away since before dawn, stood up and walked over and witnessed the signature without being asked. He had come up the night before without telling anyone. He had slept outside with his coat for a blanket because he wanted to be there, though he had not fully known until this moment what he had wanted to be there for. Harmon straightened and folded the paper and handed it to Alara. She put it in her coat. For a moment, the three of them stood together on the plateau in the morning heat, the stone structure between them and the valley visible below, brown and broken and waiting. "Go back down," Alara said. "Tell them to come." He descended the trail alone. She watched him go. Then she turned and went inside the capstone structure and descended the shaft and sat for a while in the main chamber in the dark, with the lantern unlit, listening to the sound of the four galleries, the steady, patient percussion of water finding stone and following slope and accumulating in the dark. She stayed there until she heard voices above her. They came up in the full heat of the morning of June 15th, 1879. 31 people moving slowly up the switchback trail on the western face of the anvil. Harmon led them. He had gone back to town the previous evening, and he had gone to every remaining household and said what needed to be said, and the people had listened in the way that people listen when they have exhausted every other option, and the only thing left is to listen. They were gaunt. The children, especially with their large eyes, in the particular careful way they moved, conserving energy without being told to. The women carried empty buckets. The men walked with the effortful posture of people who have been thirsty for a long time, a slight forward lean, as if they are always on the verge of reaching for something. Ilara stood at the door of the capstone structure and watched them come across the plateau toward her. Clem Dortch was beside her. He said nothing. He had said very little for most of the 6 months she had known him, and this was not a moment for talking. The procession stopped a few yards from the capstone structure and stood in a loose group looking at the small stone hut and the woman standing in front of it. Some of them had not seen Alara since December. What they saw now was different from what they remembered. Not in obvious ways. She was still slight, still young, still dressed simply. But there was something in the way she stood, in the quality of stillness she carried, that was not the stillness of a grieving girl in a black dress at the back of a crowded room. It was something older than that, something that had been earned in the darkest, a pickaxe 1 foot of stone at a time. Cal Peterson was in the group. He stood near the back, his hat in his hands. He did not look up when she looked in his direction. Harmon stepped forward. He stopped and stood for a moment and then removed his hat, a gesture so uncharacteristic that the people nearest him shifted slightly, as if the visual information did not quite process. "Miss Vance," he said. She waited. The crowd waited. He looked at the ground for a moment. Then he looked up and met her eyes with the steadiness of a man who has decided that if he is going to do this, he is going to do it completely. "We were wrong," he said. His voice was even and clear, carrying to the people behind him without effort. "Every one of us in that room in December. We were wrong about the water, and we were wrong about you, and we were wrong about your grandfather." He paused. "I was wrong, more than anyone." The words went out across the plateau, and the wind took them, and there was silence. Alara looked at his face for a moment. Then she looked at the people behind him, at the gaunt children, and the careful women, and the men whose certainty had been baked out of them by months of sun and loss. She looked at Peterson, still not meeting her eyes. She looked at the families who had held their ground through the worst of it, who had stayed when others left, who had reduced themselves to half a bucket of water per day, and the grim particular stubbornness of people who do not know how to leave a place that is theirs. There was nothing in her expression that resembled triumph. Triumph was for contests, and this had never been a contest. It had been a drought. It had been a problem with a solution that required someone to see it. "Come down," she said simply, "one at a time. The ladder is strong." She opened the door, and the cool air came out and moved across the crowd in a wave, and several people made sounds they could not help making, small, involuntary sounds of relief at the simple fact of cool air in a season without it. She stood aside. Harmon went first. She listened to him descend again, more steadily, this time, and then she heard him at the bottom, and then she heard the first sound from below, a long exhaled breath that carried up the shaft and reached the people standing in the heat above it, and the woman standing nearest the opening put her hand over her mouth. One by one they went down. Alara stood at the surface and managed the ladder and the lanterns, and she listened to the sounds that came up from below. The sharp intake of breath when eyes adjusted to the glistening walls. The quiet, the sound of water being drawn and drunk. The sound more than once of crying, which is a sound that does not need explanation in certain circumstances, and this was one of them. A woman named Dorothea Briggs came up the ladder after her turn below, with her young son on her hip and her face wet, and she stopped at the top and looked at Alara, and she said, "How?" And she was not asking a technical question. Alara looked at her. She looked at the boy on her hip, who was drinking from a tin cup with the focused, oblivious intensity of a small child doing the most important thing. She said, "My grandfather listened to this rock for 20 years. Dorothea Briggs looked at her a moment longer and then nodded and stepped aside for the next person to descend. Peterson was near the end of the group going down. When he came back up, he stood at the surface and looked at Alara, and there was a quality in his face that she had not seen on him before, something stripped back to its essentials, the face under the face that most people spend their lives making sure no one sees. "I laughed," he said. "In December. I was one of the ones who laughed." She looked at him. "I know," she said. He nodded once heavily and went to stand with the others. When the last person had been down and come back up, the group stood on the plateau in the afternoon heat and looked at each other and looked at the small stone structure and looked at Alara, and the quality of the silence was different from any silence she had heard from them before. Not the silence of dismissal, not the silence of people waiting for a powerful man to tell them what to think. The silence of people who have understood something they cannot yet put into words. Harmon came to stand beside her and looked out over the valley below. "What do you need?" he said. "For the distribution, the logistics." She had been thinking about this for weeks. "A pipeline," she said. "Hollow juniper logs sealed with pine pitch running from the base of the mesa to a central cistern in town. From the cistern, a rationing system based on household size, not land acreage. A maintenance schedule for the galleries, which will need to be cleared of mineral deposits twice a year. And a record book kept at the town hall documenting the water levels in the reservoir every week, without exception." He listened to all of it. He did not argue with any of it. "We'll need labor for the pipeline," he said. She looked at the group of people on the plateau, at the ranchers and farmers and the women, and the few older children who had come up the mountain that morning with their empty buckets. "They're standing right here," she said. "The pipeline took 3 months to build. It was finished in the first week of September 1879, on a morning when the light was slightly different from the summer light, the first faint suggestion of autumn, in the angle of the sun across the valley floor. The logs had been sourced from the upper mesa, and the slopes of the nearby range hollowed with a long auger bit fitted end to end, with tapered joints sealed with pine pitch boiled down to the right consistency over an open fire. The line ran 1,400 feet from the capstone structure down the western face of the anvil to a stone cistern built in the center of Stone Creek. The day they opened the valve at the top of the line and watched the water move through the first log section, and then the second, and then the third, working its way down the mountain by gravity alone, was a day that no one who witnessed it forgot. When the first water came out of the cistern's drain pipe in the center of town, it came out as a thin, clear thread that curved down into the waiting bucket of the first person in line. The sound it made, the sound of water in a bucket after months of silence, was received by the people standing around it with the quality of attention usually given to music. Harmon was there. He stood at the back of the crowd and watched. He had done what was asked of him without further resistance. He had signed the document acknowledging Jedediah's accuracy and stood in the town hall while the county clerk read it aloud to the assembled remaining population of Stone Creek. He had canceled Clem Dortch's note and filed the transfer at the county office. He had provided the labor of his ranch hands for the pipeline construction and the materials for the cistern without being asked twice. He was not a changed man in the simple way that stories sometimes offer. He was still Silas Harmon, still large, still accustomed to occupying the center of a room. But he moved differently now, with a certain quality of attention that was new, a tendency to listen a moment longer before speaking, to consider more carefully the information coming from sources he would previously have dismissed. On the morning the water came down the mountain, he stood at the back of the crowd and watched Alara manage the cistern valve and the distribution system with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything, and he looked at her with an expression that contained many things, but that was at its core the expression of a man learning something he should have learned a long time ago. The Water Council met for the first time on September 12, 1879, in the Stone Creek Town Hall. Alara sat at the head of the table. Harmon sat at the far end. Peterson and Clem Dortch and Dorothea Briggs and four others sat along the sides. Roscoe Finch sat near the middle with a ledger open in front of him. She had written the charter herself by lamplight on the mesa over 3 evenings. It established the rationing system, the maintenance schedule, the record-keeping requirements, and the principle that governed all of it, that water was a shared resource distributed by need, maintained by collective labor, and owned by no one. She read it aloud from the beginning. No one interrupted. She began holding lessons 2 weeks after that on Tuesday and Thursday mornings at the mouth of the capstone structure. She brought Jedediah's maps in the translated Kannat text and her own notebook from the construction phase, and she taught whoever came, which was most of the people who remained in the valley, about the geology of the formation and the engineering of the system and the principles of groundwater movement and the specific maintenance tasks that would keep the galleries clear and the collection channels running at capacity. Harmon came to every session. He sat on a piece of excavated sandstone in the front, and he took notes in a pocket ledger with the same precise handwriting he used for his cattle records. He asked questions that were direct and practical and showed that he had read the previous session's notes before arriving. Peterson came to most of them. He did not ask questions. He listened. Clem Dortch came to all of them and rarely spoke during the lessons, but could be found afterward in the late afternoon walking the galleries below with a lantern and checking the pillar bases and the collection channel joints with the attentive care of a man who has decided that something matters and is acting accordingly. The Great Drought of 1879 lasted through the following year. The rain came back slowly in the spring of 1880, tentative at first and then more confidently, and the Redemption River found its levels again by summer, and the valley began the long process of returning to what it had been. But the people who had come through the drought were not the people who had entered it. They were quieter in certain ways, more careful, less inclined to the particular confidence that comes from never having been genuinely afraid. They had learned something that cannot be taught in ordinary times, the specific knowledge of what it means to need water and not have it, and that knowledge lived in them permanently in the way that important things do. The anvil was not called the anvil anymore. No one made a formal decision to change the name. It simply changed the way things change when the understanding of them changes. People referred to it at first as Vance's Mesa, then as simply the Mesa, and eventually among the families who had been there, as simply up top, said with a particular quality of recognition, the way you refer to a place that has become part of the common memory. Alara was still there on the morning of the first autumn rain of 1880, sitting on the flat top of the capstone structure, with her boots on the stone and Jedediah's journal open on her knee. The rain came in from the west in a gray curtain moving across the valley below, with the slow inevitability of something that has been away for a long time and has found its way back. She watched it come. She felt the first drops on her hands and on the pages of the journal, and she looked down at the last entry Jedediah had written 2 weeks before he died. It was shorter than most of his entries, written in a hand slightly less steady than his usual one, the hand of a man who knows he is near the end of his energy. I have measured what I can measure, he had written. I have listened as long as I have been given to listen. The rest is for someone else. I believe they will find what I have found. I believe the stone will tell them, as it has told me, if they are willing to be still and patient and honest about what they hear. She turned to the next page. It was blank. She had known it was blank. She had looked at it many times since December of the year before. But she had been waiting, not for the right time exactly, but for the right understanding, for the things she needed to know before she could begin. She looked out at the rain moving across the valley. She looked at the brown land taking the first water slowly, the way very dry ground does, resisting at first and then accepting the dust darkening and the cracks in the hard pan softening at their edges. She looked at the blank page. She took out her pencil. She wrote, "The water is here. It has always been here. We were simply not asking correctly." She sat for a while in the rain with the journal on her knee and the pencil in her hand. Then she kept writing and the rain kept coming down, and far below the Redemption River began very slowly and very quietly to rise.